Kia ora, mi atu ki te whānau nei. Kone kosu taku ingoa no uri o taranaki maunga, raua ko titirangi maunga ko uawa. Just by virtue of what we're going to have a look at today, we'll start with a very general look at some of our crops, but we'll start with a karakia to set the scene. And then I'm just going to basically have a conversation about the hui. And not with a PowerPoint or anything else, but with a few things to show off at this end of the screen. And really wanting some questions from you all to, to help progress how we understand the hui and what we can do with it. And certainly as a tool to get back to some of our more traditional crops. So we'll start with karakia. This karakia is the one we use for most of our wānanga. It's written by one of our karaua, Uirangi Waikiripuru. I'm originally from a place called Mutunui, which is just out of Waitara. Uirangi also comes from up our way. And this is so quite a generic karakia, but we use it for most of our wānanga to do with the crops. So, and I think if you want, we will share it later through Tangiaere, because she has it there. Okay, he karakia. E whakataka te hau ki tūru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atakura, e teo, e huka, e hauhu tihei mauri ora. So, kia ora anō. The hui, and I think I've got one here I'll sort of hold up just as a signal of time. What do we know about the hui, and how many of you have grown the hui? Because more and more we look at Māori crops as kai crops more than anything else, and we're interested in the hui not just for the kai, because you can eat different components of the crop, but for many people it's grown as an instrument, a musical instrument, and for some it's toi Māori for artistic works. But what do we know about the crop itself? So, and what do we need to know if we want to grow that crop? So let's start from the beginning, the whakapapa, I guess. And as I understand it, the hui is aligned to the goddess Putehui, and she's a daughter of Tane Mahuta, which aligns her to our forest plants and foods. But as a daughter of Tane Mahuta, she was responsible for a number of things, but more than anything, she aligns to the entertainment, because her fruits were grown and embellished and used as entertainment to keep children amused, to be able to entertain the community at large. So her primary use was an entertainment. Secondary use was as a container for storing kai. And if you think about the old days, they would have stored flesh, bird meat and that sort of thing within the dried hui in bird fat. And the third use was that immature hui were eaten like cucumber. They were, before they hardened up, they were harvested like young cucumber, and they were eaten as a fruit effectively. And the runners, the wini, were harvested to be steamed. So a whole range of uses that come from this one plant. But for many people, and certainly nowadays, have never grown the hui as a crop. People grow the kumara, people grow the taiwa, the kāinga, but they don't tend to grow the hui, partly because they haven't got access to good seed, I guess, but also because they're less familiar with this crop. So we grow hui where I am every year, mostly to get fresh seed, so that we have one of the drawbacks, if you like, of growing hui is that the only way it's propagated is from seed. And in traditional times, almost all of our crops that were brought in with the migrations were grown from vegetative cuttings. So the kumara was from cuttings, the kauka was from cuttings, but the hui was from seed. And it's one of the few crops that we have a relationship with the seed and how we work with the seed to produce that crop. So the seed in the hui is really only viable for one season. If you're lucky, it might be viable for two, but generally it's a very precious seed that doesn't have a long lifespan. And the best way to store it, of course, is within the hui itself until you're ready to start planting for the next season. We'll have a look at that a little bit later on. So here we have a plant that has a history, a long-standing history through our whakapapa, right back to the origins of time, which tells us that it's been a part of who we are for as long as our memory stands. But the second is that it had a variety of uses, and most of those uses have been subsumed by other things in this day and age. So it's a relegated crop, if you like. So we grow it here. I'm in the Manawatu, and this is not tropical, and it's not cold in any regard during the summer either. So it grows in much of the country. I don't think it grows terribly well south of about Canterbury. And that's not because the summers are cold, but it's because the summers are not long enough. So this is a crop that needs at least 4 to 5 months of light and heat to become a harvestable, good size hui. So a short summer, they suffer from not enough heat to get to that maturity, and the longer the summer, the better quality the hui at the end of that season. So we have, I'm just looking for some seed. We have, for example, this hui here, which was harvested from last year. We've broken into it in the base here to take the seed out of it. And the seed is, I'll have to find it, it's no bigger than your fingernail here, but it's very, it needs well managing. In the old days, they would soak that seed for 1 to 2 days in fresh water just to invigorate it and get it to start coming back into life, because the seed is in a dormant stage, of course. So it was traditional to put it into a woven basket and put it into a slow-moving water so that it would soak for a couple of days to reinvigorate that seed. It's called priming in modern terms. And priming is prepping our seed so that it all germinates at the same time. This is September, and we wouldn't be planting this crop until the soil is warm enough to receive it. So planting in this part of the world would be late October. In the north of Auckland, that sort of area, would probably be the end of September to get it into the ground. The soil needs to be around about 12, 13 degrees Celsius at the planting depth. And what happens with soil is after the winter, the wetness of the winter and the colder temperatures hold that cold soil until it starts to dry out and that moisture starts to move down the soil. So it's generally about the end of September north and coming south. We would prepare the ground the same as if we were going to grow similar crops, pumpkins or squash or cucumbers, kamu. We prepare it in the same way. And if we wanted to follow the traditional way, we would prepare mounds the same as we do for kamu. And the mounds, lift the soil so there's a raised bed to plant the seed in. If it's approximately about 1 meter wide, then you would put 4 or 5 seed in that one mound and let them grow in a circular fashion so that they become the skirt around that mound. The raised bed means that the roots, as they establish, are not too wet and not too cold. They get a chance to establish nicely, but also that you can manage the area where the seed are from any weeds that might establish before the crop. Hui are reasonably quick to emerge, but they're not the fastest growing in the first few weeks, so sometimes the weeds grow faster than the crop itself. Modern growers may grow them in rows, the same as you might do for the kumara. Either way is fine, so long as they have the room to spread. So if you were going to grow them in mounds, you would grow each mound around about 2 meters apart. So that gives room between each mound for them to spread. They take probably at least 2 weeks for them all to emerge if you've got fresh seed, good seed. And then they'll take several weeks to establish themselves, to become self-sustaining. They produce enough leaves to work with the sun, to work with the environment, and they start to think about it's time to start flowering, it's time to start setting some fruit. Now, one of the tricks for all of our crops is that if we're looking to use our crops for several uses, one is that we want seed for next year. So we have to recognise, and this applies to all our crops, the taiwa, the kumara, etc. We want some for the practical use, for eating, or for the use straight away from the field, but we want some for seed for next year, otherwise we don't have a future crop. And we also want some to share. The seed, our priority is always the seed for next year, because that's the continuation of whakapapa for that plant. So with all these crops, the first fruits, the ones that set first, are the strongest fruits, and they become the containers, the receptacles for our seed for next year. So when this plant has grown sufficiently that it starts to flower, we will allow the fruit to set, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the first fruit gets tagged and left as the seed-bearing fruit. So we keep it specifically for the seed. That's because the plant puts all its energy into the first fruit before the competition comes from the later fruit. So once the other fruits start to set, it has to share those resources. So we're looking for the best attributes to take forward to the future crops. So the hui, you can grow it on the ground, or you can grow it on a frame to let them grow off the ground. When they flower, they'll produce some very bright white flowers, and those flowers are pollinated at night time. They're pollinated by moths. The bright white color of the petals is really to reflect in the moonlight, and that moonlight encourages the moths to come into the crop, and their activity on the flowers encourages pollination. So these are a night pollinating plant, and that's different to most of the plants that we're familiar with, and that we rely on the bees and other activity during the day. So the hui in particular, if you're growing them indoors in a covered house or what have you, allow the doors to be open so that at night time the moths and what have you will come and visit those flowers and pollinate them going forward. The other thing is that if you have too many flowers, they start to become too competitive. So if they set well, and you might have on each plant, say 6 fruit have set, well, 6 is too many for that plant to manage well. And even in the old days, in the traditional times, they would thin those fruit out to aim to get a bigger hui, a bigger gourd, which they could use for various reasons. So let them set, and when you have sufficient set, thin out the weaker looking fruit or the late ones that are going to struggle to keep up with the early fruit, and maintain probably 4 to 6 at the very most on each plant. So it all depends how much fruit they've got access to as to what they can handle. So here's a crop that's going to take the whole of the winter, the summer, sorry. I'm thinking winter because we've just gone back to a cold day here. It's going to take the whole of the summer to mature. If you harvest the small hui when they're only 4 to 6 inches long, they're still soft, they won't cure with a hard skin, and they will be sort of limited in what use they have. But if you allow them to sit on the plant for the full summer, then they will harden in the shell. And once they're harvested, that outer skin will cure itself, and you get a long, an endurance sort of hui that will last forever, basically, because the shell is both thick enough and and cured well enough that it will last forever and can be carved or can be used decoratively for various reasons. So that means if you're planting in September, I wouldn't even be thinking to harvest the hui until the plant shows signs of dying off, which would be in around the end of February or perhaps even March. So by that time, and this is the same as your kamokamu, you know that the mildew comes into your crops towards the end of the summer. And the mildew comes into the crops because by then the plants are exhausted and they don't have the ability to fight off the attack of fungus or other environmental factors. So the mildew comes in, that's a sign that the plant has done its thing. And it's a sign for you to harvest what's on those plants, take the plant material away so that that mildew doesn't hang around for future crops, and then look at how you might cure those hui. When you harvest them, they're a bit like this, they're green. And this green hui has a skin on the outside and it has the wooden shell inside, a bit like the walnut and what have you. So the skin protects it while it's growing. And now that it's done its job, it's fruited, it's got seed inside here, which is the task of the plant. And that seed is to look after the next generation. We want to cure it so that we can make use of this in various ways. The old way to cure this is generally to let it start to deteriorate. There's another one here where you'll see the skin starts to rot off, and then bury it in sand, dry sand, and just keep it buried up to the neck in the sand and let that skin dry off and rot away naturally. When it comes out of the skin, you'll get a nice dry hui that can then be used for a number of reasons. A good hui should be so hard that if you drop it, knock it, bang it, everything else, it won't break. It's pretty resilient, they will last forever. Again, in the old days, if you want to cut this and make a lid out of it, you need to cut it while it's still at least half green, because it's too hard to cut cleanly outside. So you can cut it down this. If you want a hui that is flat and round, then you will allow it to grow on the ground. If you want a hui with a neck like this, it will hang from a fence. The flowers, so it's growing up a trellis or up a fence. As they hang, this teardrop shape comes into being. So you can train your hui for the different shapes, the different uses. The people that want to use them for musical instruments, they want this handle to be able to work with. The people that want them for containers, they want the big round hui so that they can do that. One of the other uses in the old days was as a boiling receptacle, like a pot, to boil your soft green plants, your condiments. So things like watercress, some of the more weed, so the tohitaka, those sorts of things that were used as a green vegetable, would be placed into a bowl that was from the hui. The bowl would have those greenery and water, and then hangi stones, very hot stones, would be put into that water to boil it, and that's how they would cook those greens and soften them to add to their meal. So they become a condiment for their kai, because often you didn't have a large range of dietary options, and being able to do that soft food, which was very popular, that's what the hui had another use for. So that's a very brief introduction. I'm just going to show you a couple of carved hui. So here's one which one of our students have been working on recently, and this is just carved with the what do you call it? They like a pin, a wicker pin that just cuts into it with the heat. And this is basically our students practicing with different natural materials. In this case, they've carved in the maunga, but it's an example of how the hui gives them a tactile experience with a product from our crops, and with an opportunity to put a story into the carving. So this one was done locally, actually done out at by the youth prison, the boys there. And these hui this size, this shape, were grown locally, so they grow quite nicely in this part of the world. I think the other thing is we have a book which has quite a lot of information on the hui and some of the other green vegetables, which our Growers Collective sell this book. It's available for people if you have a look at the Tahuri Whenua website. So a lot of the information we're just talking about how to grow the hui and what conditions it needs to grow are summarised in these books. We'll finish off with one last look at the life cycle of the plant. The hui belongs to the same family as the cucurbits, so that's your pumpkins, your cucumbers, kamo, but it doesn't cross with the kamo and the pumpkins and that, because it's a different species within that family. So the kamo crosses very easily with pumpkins because they're the same species, and you get a mixed parentage often for that crop. The hui, because it's a different species within that family, doesn't cross, so you can grow it in the same general field, general location as you grow those other cucurbits, but it does suffer from the same pests and diseases. So those hui that are on the ground, their biggest threat are the slugs and the snails and those the birds, the pukeku and all of that that come into the garden. The hui that is on the climbing vine is less issue around those sort of pests, but there's still problems with the plants itself, with the being able to hold the weight of fruit and what have you that come onto the vine. So you still have to look after it in much the same way. They don't generally have any fungal problems until the end of the season, which is when the plant becomes old and weak. So they don't need spraying. They don't really need any inputs other than managing the weeds around the crop as they grow. And that means that the crop becomes a dominant plant. The hui plant becomes the dominant one in the field. So they're pretty easy to grow in that regard. And I suspect the hardest thing for most people now is getting good seed or access to good quality seed. They'll grow in any soil. The main thing is that you can feed the soil. And if you're going to feed the soil, you should do that before you plant the seed. So build in compost to your mounds and all of that, because you want the food to be available when the plant needs it rather than you coming in late. And once they've settled, once they are running, they will look after themselves. Give them the space to run and give them the opportunity for those moths to come in and visit come night time. That's it. They're not too hard to grow. We've still got some seed to take out of some of our hui. We have, I think, got a handout that we were putting online with Haimata, just with the basics for growing the hui. So please make access to that to get the key information. But otherwise, don't be shy to be in touch, because the season is coming close for all of your crops. This is the move from winter into the koanga to spring. So this is the time to start preparing, even if it's not the time to start planting. So miha te kia koutou, good luck with your crops.
Kia ora matua, Nick. One of the participants made a comment about lots of mātauranga in this short webinar with yourself, and I totally agree. We've got a couple of things I'd like to just mention. I have a couple of people who have said no taranaki rāua, and it's a ko Aroha Reid, no Ngārouru, and ko Jerry Allen, no Taranaki. So a couple of our participants are from your home. But we have a number of questions. The first one is, and this has been asked several times, is how do they get really good hui seed? Where do they go to see if they can obtain it?
It is a good question. We're sort of growing more and more for seed purposes. Originally we were we were growing just a selection of hui just to have a carryover each season, but more and more people are wanting to have a go at growing them. I don't think there's much available commercially. I think you have to know people to get that seed. We haven't opened up some of our hui yet, so I'm not sure how much seed we've got. But if people can't find any seed, then by all means be in touch, and if we have, we can make sure we share it. But we just say we don't know quite now what we've got. It may be that somewhere in the mix we want to encourage someone to grow seed for sharing in the future year. So
well, it's for those panelists who are good time to start. If we can start to form a rōpū here, that we might be able to, as Matua Nick says, share this seed, whatever we're doing in the future. So a couple of other questions, Matua. One asked, Kohuroa Rufio has asked, how did you get interested in the hui? What sparked your interest, considering a lot of, as you said, most people have had a lot to do with the kumara, with the kamu. What sparked your interest in the hui?
Well, I don't think any one thing in particular, because I work with food crops.
Yeah.
So it just was a natural progression from the kumara and the different crops. You know, when I was young and we lived up the coast, then all of our time was spent with kumara and corn. Effectively, they were the two key crops, if you like. And a few people grew the taiawa. Now people are getting interested in some of those lesser known crops, so even the kokihi, the spinach and the hui. But because my job is with growing kai, then these are sort of a natural progression from what we started working with. I started my working life working on potato crops commercially, you know, running the picking gangs. Used to go around picking crops in the 70s. So yeah, I always think when you want to work with plants, your first task is to understand the life cycle of that plant, and then you know what it is you have to do to support the plant to be able to get it to the point you can harvest or eat or what have you. So that's talking about the hui is just really talking about the life cycle of a plant that we want to be able to involve ourselves with.
Right, I think that would lead itself to another question that is around the preparation on the ground for growing of the hui. Is there anything special that needs to be done apart from what you would normally do for a good preparation for any crops?
Nothing too specific. So yeah, the preparation is much as with other crops, but you just want to make sure that there's some organic matter in the soil. So that's mixing in compost or digging in whatever was growing in there last year, digging in the tops so that it breaks down over the winter to become organic matter. The only crop I would say that you don't want to follow, because when you think about growing crops in the same soil year after year after year, you need to think about a rotation. And the only one that you would not follow is watermelons, because watermelons are susceptible to a root rot. And if they get that, then that rot sits in the soil and the next crop that comes along may get the same rot. So you try and have a different crop in between watermelons and hui. Otherwise, it's just open. It's just having a site that's warm.
Kapai, one last question before I start wrapping it up. We've had some really good questions actually, but one of the panelists has talked about, participants have talked about the mounds. Are you talking about like a handful of mound, or is it a large mound that you're putting it in? Not sure.
I'm talking about a mound that probably looks like a rubbish bin lid, about 1 metre wide and only about 3 or 4 inches high. So you just scratch a circular mound, maybe about 1 metre wide, pat it down, and then do a 5.1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seed into that mound, or 3 or 4, however you've got, and let the hui grow strategically out from that mound. So you feed the mound, you make sure the mound's clean of weeds, and it's a bit warmer. It gives them an earlier start if they're up in the mound.
Kapai.